The fluorescent lights of the community clubhouse conference room hummed with a sterile, indifferent buzz. They cast a pale, unflattering light on the 5 members of the Sterling Crossings Homeowners Association Board of Directors, who sat behind a long folding table like a panel of weary, underpaid judges. At the center, of course, was Karen Whitmore. Her posture was impeccable, her silver blonde hair sculpted into a helmet of serene authority. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips as Richard Langley, the association's long-suffering treasurer, cleared his throat to read the verdict. I stood before them, alone, a single folder clutched in my hand. My heart wasn't pounding. It was a slow, heavy thud against my ribs, a metronome marking the time of a profound and public injustice. The board has reviewed the evidence submitted regarding violation W734B. Richard began, his voice devoid of emotion as he read from the sheet in front of him. Pertaining to the property at 112 Arbor Lane, owned by Mr. Mark Jensen. The violation: failure to maintain property in good repair, specifically concerning the northern-facing fence line, has been found valid. A murmur rippled through the 24 homeowners seated in the plastic chairs behind me. I kept my eyes fixed on Karen. She met my gaze, her expression a perfect mask of civic concern. Pursuant to Article 9, Section 3 of the Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, Richard continued, and following the documented issuance of a courtesy notice on May 5th, a formal violation notice on May 12th, and a notice of hearing on May 26th, the board hereby imposes a fine of $200. He paused, adjusting his glasses. Furthermore, a recurring fine of $50 per week will be levied until the aforementioned fence is repaired to community standards. This decision is effective immediately. The folder in my hand felt suddenly heavier. It contained photographs, police report numbers, and a detailed timeline, irrefutable proof that the fence had been destroyed not by my neglect, but by the repeated, deliberate actions of the woman sitting at the center of the table. Proof the board had deemed inconclusive. Karen leaned toward her microphone, the small smile finally blossoming. The board's primary duty is to protect the aesthetic integrity and property values of Sterling Crossings for all residents, she said, her voice smooth and reasonable. We simply cannot allow dilapidated structures to become an eyesore. I'm sure you understand. Mark? I understood perfectly. I understood that the system, designed to maintain order, had been hijacked to serve a personal vendetta. I understood that truth, presented calmly and rationally, was no match for entrenched power and brazen lies. As Richard droned on about the appeals process, a process I knew would be a futile gesture, I didn't feel anger. The initial rage had burned out weeks ago, leaving behind something colder, harder, and infinitely more patient. I was an architect. I built things. I understood that, to erect a new structure, you sometimes had to first survey the ground, find the weaknesses in the old foundation, and, meticulously, systematically, tear it all down. And as I stood there, a newly fined and publicly shamed homeowner, I knew exactly what I had to build next. Not a fence, but a case. And its foundation would be the one thing Karen Whitmore could not control: the truth. Recorded, certified, and undeniable. It had all started with a sense of profound satisfaction. I bought the house at 112 Arbor Lane 7 months prior. A simple, but well-built 2-story colonial that backed onto a sliver of association-owned common area, a neatly manicured greenbelt. My previous life had been spent in city apartments, where the only thing I owned was the air within my walls. Here, I owned the ground. I could plant a tree. I could build a fence. And I did. For 3 weekends, I measured, dug, and built. The fence wasn't a spiteful barrier, but a frame for my small canvas of the American dream. Each post was sunk 2 feet deep in concrete. Each pine board was perfectly spaced and secured. When I applied the final coat of crisp, white paint, I felt a pride that was almost primal. This was mine. I had made it. My first interaction with Karen Whitmore had been brief and unsettling. It was a week after the fence was completed. She had been gliding down the sidewalk on her afternoon patrol, her gaze sweeping across each property with the critical eye of a drill sergeant. She paused at my driveway. "Mr. Jensen," she'd called out, her voice carrying an odd mixture of forced friendliness and condescension. "It's Mark, please." "Mark," she repeated, though the correction didn't seem to register. "The new fence is quite white." "Thank you. It's exterior satin white, approved on the architectural request form." She gave a tight, bloodless smile. "Yes, I saw the form. It's just a shame about the placement. So close to the common path." She gestured vaguely toward the greenbelt behind my house. "It really closes off the view." I glanced back at the fence, then at the wide expanse of grass. There was no common path behind my lot, just manicured turf. My property line extends 15 feet back from the fence. I explained politely. I had a copy of the plat map from my closing documents to be sure. Karen's smile tightened further. The official maps can be so misleading. There are historical easements, view corridors, things that don't always show up on a standard survey. As board president, I'm familiar with all of them. She didn't elaborate. She simply let the veiled warning hang in the air before continuing her silent, judgmental procession down the street. That evening, a vague sense of unease prompted me to pull out the thick binder of documents I'd received at closing. I was a meticulous person by trade. I'd read them all before signing. But now, I looked again with a new focus. I found the community's plat map, a detailed drawing filed with Montgomery County. My lot. 47 was clearly delineated. The 15-foot buffer of private property behind my fence was unambiguous. There was no mention of a view corridor. Then I leafed through the Declaration of Covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The CC&Rs, the nearly 100-page Bible of Sterling crossings. The language was dense, legalistic. I scanned the sections on property maintenance, fences, and common areas. My eyes snagged on a particularly convoluted clause. Figure 8.4.2 titled Easement and Common Area Use. It was a wall of text about utility access, drainage rights of way, and the board's authority to interpret usage for the general benefit of the community. I dismissed it as boilerplate, the kind of catch-all legal jargon that lawyers love and homeowners ignore. It was a mistake I would come to regret. I closed the binder, reassured by the solid lines on the map, but unsettled by the woman who seemed to believe she had the power to redraw them with a wave of her hand. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning. The sound was a sickening crack of splintering wood, followed by the roar of an engine. I ran to the back window and saw it Karen Whitmore's pearl-white Range Rover bouncing off my lawn, leaving a trail of tire tracks as it swerved back onto the street. A 10-foot section of my new fence was reduced to a jagged ruin of broken boards. I stood there for a full minute, stunned. It had to be an accident. She must have lost control, taken the turn from her own driveway across the street too sharply, annoyed, but assuming a simple resolution. I walked outside to inspect the damage. The tire tracks were deep, cutting a direct, deliberate path from the street, across my side yard, and through the fence. I did what any responsible citizen would do. First, I called the non-emergency police line and filed a report for destruction of property. An officer came, took my statement, photographed the damage, noted the tire tracks leading from the direction of Karen's driveway, and gave me a case number. He was polite but pragmatic. Unless you have a video of her hitting it. or she admits to it. He said with a shrug, "It's your word against hers. This is likely a civil matter." Next, I sent a calm, factual email to Premier Management, the company that ran the HOA's daily operations. I attached photos, provided the police report number, and requested that they contact Ms. Whitmore regarding reimbursement for the repairs. I expected an apology, an exchange of insurance information, the mundane bureaucratic process of making things right. 3 days later, on May 5th, I received my answer. It wasn't a phone call from an apologetic neighbor. It was a letter from Premier Management, a courtesy notice of violation. My heart sank as I read the words, "An inspection of your property has revealed a violation of the community's governing documents. Specifically, failure to maintain property in good repair broken fence." There, in black and white, was the twisted logic of Karen's world. She had destroyed my property, and I was being blamed for it. I immediately called the management company. The portfolio manager, a harried-sounding woman named Cynthia, was vaguely sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice tinny over the speakerphone. "But the violation stands. The fence is broken. The board requires that you submit a plan for its repair within 7 days. But your board president is the one who broke it. I sent you the police report number." There was a pause, the sound of keys clicking. "Yes, I see that note here. However, the board has reviewed the matter and found the report inconclusive. Ms. Whitmore denies the incident, without definitive proof. The responsibility for maintaining the property remains with the homeowner." The call ended. I stood in my kitchen, the letter trembling slightly in my hand. Inconclusive. The system wasn't just broken. It was a weapon. And Karen Whitmore was aiming it directly at me. That night, I called my older sister, Sarah. She was a corporate lawyer, a pragmatist who navigated complex systems for a living. I laid out the whole story, my voice tight with frustration. She listened patiently until I was done, then said the words that would become my mantra. "Okay, little brother, this is her arena, and she's a master of it. You can't win by getting emotional. You need to switch games. Don't get angry. Get organized." "What does that even mean?" I asked, slumping onto my couch. "The board is her private club." "It means you document everything," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "Every call, every letter, every broken board. Date it, time it, photograph it. You create a paper trail so dense she can't wave it away, and you start digging into the rules she's using against you. You're an architect. Mark, you live by codes and specifications. Treat this the same way. Find the load-bearing walls of her power, and then find the cracks." She paused. "And one more thing. Are you absolutely sure there's no easement on your property? Did you check the final plat map filed with the county, not just the copy they gave you at closing?" Her question hung in the air. I had only looked at the copy. It was a small detail. But in the war I was about to enter, I was beginning to learn that there were no small details. There was only ammunition. The next Saturday, I repaired the fence. It was a bitter, frustrating task, replacing the pristine boards I had installed only weeks before. As I worked, I felt the weight of my neighbors' gazes. I saw curtains twitch. I caught a few sympathetic nods. But no one approached me. They knew, as I was learning, that to cross Karen Whitmore was to invite trouble to your own doorstep. On May 11th, exactly 6 days after I received the courtesy notice, it happened again. Another splintering crash in the morning. Another section of my fence destroyed. This time, I had a camera running, a small security camera I'd mounted inside my office window overlooking the yard. The footage was grainy, partially obscured by a tree branch, but it clearly showed the back half of a white Range Rover accelerating away from my property line. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. I filed another police report. I sent another email to Premier Management, this time with the video file attached. Their response arrived the next day, May 12th. It was a certified letter. Inside was a formal violation notice. Dear Mr. Jensen, it began. The language colder, more severe. Your failure to remedy the violation cited in our courtesy notice of May 5th has been noted. The attached video evidence was reviewed by the board and deemed insufficient to assign liability. The vehicle is not clearly identifiable, and the driver cannot be seen. Therefore, you are hereby ordered to repair the fence within 10 days. Failure to comply will result in a formal hearing and the imposition of fines. I stared at the letter, a cold fury solidifying in my chest. Insufficient. They were gaslighting me with bureaucratic formality. Sarah had been right. This wasn't a fight I could win by appealing to reason or fairness. This was a structural problem. My sister's advice echoed in my mind. Get organized. The following Monday, my campaign began. It started not with a hammer or a lawyer, but with a simple, legally mandated request. I drove to the post office and sent a certified letter to Premier Management, formally requesting access to association records, as was my right under our state's Common Interest Development Act. I asked for the past 3 years of board meeting minutes, all executed contracts with current vendors, the association's financial statements, and a copy of the original county-filed plat map for the Sterling Crossings development. Next, I made a phone call and scheduled an appointment with a man named Arthur Gable. He was a professional land surveyor, a crusty, by-the-book expert whose website promised unimpeachable boundary certification. He wasn't cheap, but I was done relying on copies and assumptions. I needed a definitive, legally binding survey of my property, stamped and certified. Days later, a thick manila envelope arrived from Premier Management. I sat at my dining room table, which had become my command center, and began to sort through the contents. The financial statements were straightforward enough. The meeting minutes, however, were another story. They were a study in sterile, passive language. A motion was made. A motion was seconded. The motion carried. But as I delved deeper, I noticed a pattern. Under the section for new business, in meeting after meeting, the landscaping contract was discussed. The company's name was Whitmore Lawn and Garden LLC. The name was so close, it felt like a taunt. More suspiciously, whenever a payment or contract extension for this company was approved, the line items in the corresponding financial reports were partially redacted. Black lines were drawn through specific invoice amounts and service descriptions. A small footnote read, "Vendor payment details redacted to protect proprietary business information." It was a flimsy excuse, and it stank of concealment. On May 25th, Arthur Gable arrived. He was a man in his late 60s with a sun-weathered face and hands that looked like they could crush stone. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He and his young assistant spent 2 hours on my property, driving wooden stakes with fluorescent pink ribbons into the ground, peering through a theodolite, and making meticulous notes on a clipboard. When he was finished, he rolled out a large preliminary drawing on the hood of his truck. He tapped a thick finger on the paper. "All right, Mr. Jensen, here's the situation. The good news is, your fence is located a good 18 inches inside your property line. You've got more room than you thought." He traced the boundary with his finger. The line is clear as day. No ambiguity. I felt a surge of relief. So there's no view corridor or historical easement. Gable let out a short, barking laugh. "A view corridor. On a residential plat like this, not a chance. That's developer talk for, I want to sell the lots up the hill for more money. It wouldn't be recorded this way if it existed. He then pointed to a thin, dotted line that ran parallel to my back property line, but a good 30 feet into the common area. That, however, is an easement. My heart skipped a beat. An easement. Yep, 10-foot wide public utility easement. See the note PUE. That's for the power lines and the sewer main. The county has the right to access it for maintenance. The HOA has to keep it clear of permanent structures, but it is not a general access corridor. And, more importantly, he stabbed his finger back at my fence. It's nowhere near your property. It's 30 feet into the common area. My mind raced, connecting the dots. Karen's vague warnings. Her citation of CC&R Fairgrade 8.4.2 about easements. Her insistence on a path. She wasn't just being a bully. She was actively misrepresenting the community's governing documents. She had twisted the existence of a utility easement deep in the common area into a justification for her personal shortcut across my yard. It was a lie built on a sliver of truth. Mr. Gable, I said slowly, this is incredibly helpful. Is there any way you can reference the official county plat map number on your final certified survey? Always do, he grunted, already starting to pack his equipment. Chain of title, plat records, the works. My surveys stand up in court. That's what you pay for. As he drove away, I felt a shift in the landscape of the conflict. I had a fact, a hard, geometric, legally certified fact. But the surveyor's visit yielded one more unexpected piece of the puzzle. As his assistant was packing up a case of equipment near my driveway, he paused and looked at the perfectly manicured lawn across the street. Karen's lawn. Man, those guys do good work, he said, nodding toward a small, discreet sign pushed into the turf near her prize-winning rose bushes. I'd seen the sign 100 times but never paid it much attention. It was dark green, with elegant white lettering. Whitmore Lawn and Garden. It read. The assistant continued. Oblivious. My uncle's in the business. Says they're the most expensive crew in the county. Can't figure out how they land all these big HOA contracts. I stood frozen. The redacted minutes. The suspicious company name. Karen's brother-in-law. Maybe I made a mental note. It was time to look up the public business filings for Whitmore Lawn and Garden LLC. The second fence incident, on May 25th, was more brazen than the first. This time, Karen drove through it in the late afternoon. When several neighbors were outside, she didn't speed away. She slowed, rolled down her window, and surveyed the damage with a look of detached disappointment before pulling into her driveway. It was a power play, a public demonstration. The next day, May 26th, the certified letter I'd been expecting arrived. A notice of hearing. I was being summoned before the board on June 15th to discuss my continued non-compliance. The letter warned that fines would be considered and imposed at the hearing. The pieces were clicking into place. Her motive wasn't just about a shortcut. It was about something bigger. The redacted contracts, the landscaping company with her name on it, her deliberate misinterpretation of the easement, it all pointed to a deeper level of corruption. She wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was running the HOA as her personal fiefdom. And my fence was a minor but intolerable act of defiance. My methodical investigation was no longer just about defending my property. It was about exposing hers. I spent that evening on the Montgomery County Clerk's website, searching the public database of business registrations. I found it in under 5 minutes. Whitmore Lawn and Garden, LLC. The registered agent and sole proprietor was not Karen Whitmore. It was a man named David Miller. A quick social media search confirmed my suspicion. David Miller's profile page was filled with family photos, in dozens of them. He was standing next to his wife and his sister-in-law, Karen Whitmore. The motive was no longer a theory. It was a fact, documented in public record. It wasn't just power. It was money. She was steering a lucrative, exclusive contract to her brother-in-law's company, likely receiving a kickback, and using her position on the board to approve the invoices, the same invoices with the blacked-out line items. My defiance, my refusal to be a doormat, was a threat to her cozy arrangement. The certified survey from Arthur Gable arrived on June 1st. It was a masterpiece of legal clarity, an 8-page document complete with maps, official seals, and references to the county's master plat. It confirmed everything. My property lines were clear, and the only easement was a utility easement 30 feet away. I now possessed the truth on paper. Just as I was feeling a surge of confidence, Karen retaliated. She must have been notified of my official records request, or perhaps she simply sensed I was digging. On June 3rd, another certified letter arrived. This one not from Premier Management, but from a law firm, Patterson, Steele and Finch. The heavy cream-colored stationery felt menacing even before I read the contents. The letter was a symphony of legal threats. It accused me of a campaign of harassment against the board president. It claimed my frivolous and burdensome records requests were disrupting the association's business. It demanded I immediately cease all contact with the board and management company outside of official hearings. And then came the final blow. Furthermore, please be advised that should you fail to pay any and all fines duly levied by the association, we are instructed to take all necessary legal action to protect our clients' interests, including but not limited to placing a lien on your property at 112 Arbor Lane. As you know, such an encumbrance can be considered a default under the terms of your mortgage agreement. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. A lien. My mortgage. This was no longer just about a fence or neighborhood politics. She was threatening my home, the single largest investment of my life. That evening, I called my father. He was a retired history professor, a quiet, thoughtful man who had always preached the virtues of compromise and keeping one's head down. I explained the situation, the survey, the financial link, and the lawyer's letter. I expected him to be outraged on my behalf. Instead, his voice was filled with worry. "Mark, this woman sounds dangerous," he said, his tone heavy. "A lien on your house. Son, is this fight really worth the risk? Maybe you should just pay the fine. Repair the fence one last time and let it go. You have to live there." His words struck a chord of doubt I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Was he right? I had evidence. Yes. But she had power and lawyers. I had truth. But she had the ability to cloud my title and jeopardize my financial stability. I pictured years of legal battles, mounting fees, and the constant, grinding stress of living next to a woman who was actively trying to ruin me. For a moment, the thought of surrender was a seductive relief. "I don't know, Dad," I admitted, the weight of the last month pressing down on me. "I just don't know." "Just be careful," he said before we hung up. "When you go after a queen, you have to be sure you don't miss. And remember, Mark, some of those other people on the board are probably just followers, not leaders. They're your neighbors. Be careful who you hurt in your quest for justice." His advice resonated deeply. This wasn't just about tearing Karen down. It was about being precise, surgical. My victory would be meaningless if it was built on the scorched earth of my own principles. I had to win, but I had to win the right way. The threat from her lawyers hadn't broken me. It had clarified my purpose. The hearing on June 15th was no longer my trial, and the annual members' meeting, scheduled for June 28th, would be hers. The annual members' meeting for Sterling Crossings was the one night a year when the veneer of suburban tranquility was peeled back to reveal the seething cauldron of petty grievances, political maneuvering, and genuine community concern that simmered beneath. It was held in the same soulless, fluorescent-lit clubhouse conference room, but instead of 24 attendees, there were over 100. This was where the budget was ratified, where new board members were elected, and, most importantly, where any homeowner could sign up for a 5-minute slot during the open forum. I had registered for my slot 2 weeks in advance. I arrived early, taking a seat in the back row. My folder, now thick with evidence, rested on my lap. On a small USB drive in my pocket was a simple, 5-slide presentation. I watched as the room filled up. Karen was at the head table, flanked by the other 4 board members. She looked confident, regal, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to Richard Langley, who would nod dutifully. She was in her element. The meeting began, a tedious procession of procedural formalities. The minutes from the last meeting were approved. Richard gave a dry presentation of the annual budget, clicking through slides of pie charts and spreadsheets. I watched the clock on the wall. 7:45 p.m. Finally, the HOA president, a man named George, who mostly just deferred to Karen, announced the open forum. We have 3 speakers signed up for tonight. Please remember to keep your comments to the 5-minute time limit. A large digital countdown clock was projected onto the screen next to the budget slides. It was set to 0500. The first speaker was an elderly woman complaining about the speed of cars on the main boulevard. The second was a young father asking for better equipment at the playground. Then, George called my name. Next up, Mark Jensen from 112 Arbor Lane. A low murmur went through the crowd. My dispute with Karen was now local legend. As I walked to the podium at the front of the room, I could feel every eye on me. I saw Karen shift in her seat, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. She likely expected me to launch into an emotional tirade about my fence, a plea she could dismiss with a calm, condescending remark about following procedure. I placed my folder on the podium and inserted the USB drive into the laptop. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady. I nodded to the board. "My name is Mark Jensen. I live at 112 Arbor Lane, and I'd like to use my 5 minutes to discuss an issue of procedural integrity and fiscal responsibility." I clicked the first slide. The clock started its silent descent. 04:55. On the screen behind me, a series of images appeared in quick succession. A photo of my pristine fence, dated April 28th. A photo of the first wreckage, dated May 3rd. A screenshot of my email to Premier Management, and a copy of Police Report, Dobrich MCO 58332. Then, a photo of the second wreckage, dated May 11th, and Police Report, MCO 59147. Over the past 2 months, I began, my tone calm and factual, like an architect presenting a structural analysis. My property has been subjected to repeated acts of vandalism, resulting in significant damage. I have followed all required procedures, notifying the management company and filing police reports. In response, I have received violation notices and fines for failure to maintain property. The clock read 04:10. Karen was watching me, her expression hardening. I clicked to the next slide. The board's justification for these actions has often been related to a supposed easement or common pathway behind my property. On the screen, the dense text of CC&R February 8.4.2 appeared. This clause, on easement and common area use, has been cited as giving the board broad interpretive power. 03:45. I clicked again. However, Broad interpretation must be based on foundational facts. Two documents now filled the screen, side by side. On the left was the official Montgomery County plat map for Sterling Crossings. On the right was the certified boundary survey of my property, stamped by Arthur Gable. P.L.S. I used the laser pointer to trace my property line. As you can see from the certified survey and the original plat map filed with the county, there is no view corridor, access path, or general easement on or near my property. The only relevant easement is a public utility easement located 30 feet inside the common area. I circled the PUE with the red dot. The assertion that a path exists across my lot is, factually, incorrect. A wave of whispers swept through the room. Homeowners were leaning forward, pointing at the screen. This wasn't just a complaint. It was evidence. The clock showed Yo 250 Yao. This leads to a more troubling question of fiscal oversight. I continued, advancing to the third slide. On the screen was a screenshot of the redacted meeting minutes, the black bars hiding the payment details for Whitmore Lawn and Garden LLC. Next to it, I displayed a screenshot from the county's public business registry, showing the owner of that company was David Miller. For the past 3 years, our community's lucrative landscaping contract has been held by a company whose finances are redacted from our records for proprietary reasons. I let that hang in the air for a second. As a matter of public record, the owner of this company is the brother-in-law of our board president, Karen Whitmore. The whispers exploded into audible gasps. Karen's face had gone from rigid control to a mask of pale fury. She grabbed her microphone. "This is out of order. This is a personal attack." George, the president, looked flustered. "Mr. Jensen, your time is—" "I have 1 minute and 30 seconds remaining," I said firmly, not taking my eyes off the audience. "And I believe a potential conflict of interest and misuse of association funds is a matter of urgent community business." The crowd voiced its agreement. "Let him speak," someone shouted from the back. George shrank back in his seat. WOA 1:20. I clicked to my final evidence slide. It showed the total annual landscaping budget over $80,000 and an excerpt from the state's Nonprofit Corporation Act regarding director conduct, which explicitly forbade self-dealing and required the disclosure of financial conflicts of interest. Our governing documents and state law are clear, I said, my voice rising slightly with emphasis. Board members have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the association. Directing contracts to family members without disclosure and transparency is a violation of that duty. I had one more piece of information in my folder, a copy of a board vote, where another member, the timid Mr. Abernathy, had approved a contract extension. He was a follower, a man easily intimidated. My father's words came back to me. Be careful who you hurt. I made a split-second decision. I looked at the board, my gaze sweeping past Abernathy and landing squarely on Karen. I am not making accusations. I am presenting documented facts and asking questions that every homeowner in this room deserves an answer to. Why are financial records being redacted? Why was the board operating on false information about property easements? And why has our board president failed to disclose her significant financial conflict of interest? 0:15. I lowered my voice, turning back to the audience. I believe these questions warrant an immediate, independent financial audit of the association's books, conducted by an outside firm with no ties to this community. The clock hit row 00R. I turned off the laser pointer. My time is up. Thank you. I walked back to my seat through a sea of stunned silence. It lasted for 3 seconds, and then the room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions at the board. Karen was banging her gavel, her face crimson. Order. This meeting is not a venue for baseless slander. But she had lost control. The narrative was no longer hers. A man in the front row, a homeowner I recognized as a retired accountant, stood up. I make a motion to commission a full, independent forensic audit of the last 3 years of the association's finances. Second, yelled a woman from across the room. The management company representative, a woman I'd never seen before, looked panicked. George, the president, stammered. That's not on the agenda. We can't. It's a motion from the floor, the accountant boomed. It requires a vote of the members present. Mr. Abernathy, looking pale and shaken, leaned toward his microphone. I believe we should vote on the motion. He wouldn't make eye contact with Karen. It was the crucial crack in her wall of support. The vote was a formality, a near-unanimous show of hands. The motion for an audit passed. Then came another motion, this one to formally censure the board president pending the results of the audit. That, too, passed with an overwhelming majority. I sat in my chair, watching the chaos unfold. Karen was gathering her papers, her hands shaking with rage. Her reign was over. She hadn't been defeated by anger or revenge. She had been dismantled by facts, brought down by a certified survey, a public record, and a 5-minute presentation. The system she had expertly manipulated had, in a public forum, finally been brought to bear against her. The weeks that followed the annual meeting were a blur of quiet, systemic change. The independent audit was commissioned immediately, and its preliminary findings were so damning that Patterson, Steele, and Finch, the HOA's law firm, promptly resigned as counsel to avoid being implicated. The final report, delivered a month later, confirmed everything I had presented and more. It detailed a pattern of non-competitive bidding, inflated invoices from Whitmore Lawn and Garden, and a clear financial trail of kickbacks funneled through a shell corporation. The entire board, including Karen, resigned in disgrace. Premier Management's contract was terminated by a unanimous vote of the newly appointed interim board. All fines against my property were expunged from the record, and I received a formal letter of apology from the association, along with a check reimbursing me for the cost of the fence repairs and the surveyor's fee. Justice, it turned out, was not only possible, it was quantifiable. Life in Sterling Crossings began to return to a new, more transparent normal. The interim board, a collection of earnest and slightly overwhelmed homeowners, asked me to chair a new transparency committee, tasked with rewriting sections of the bylaws to ensure accountability. It was a role I accepted, feeling a sense of duty to see the restoration through. It was during this process, late one evening in the now accessible HOA office, that I made the final discovery. I was sorting through a dusty box of archived files from a decade ago, looking for old vendor contracts to use as templates. Tucked inside a folder labeled Prospective Buyer Correspondence was a thin, folded letter written on personal stationery. The letterhead simply read, "From the desk of Karen Whitmore." It was dated 7 years prior, addressed to the previous owners of my house. In it, Karen made a low, almost insulting offer to buy the property. The tone was not aggressive, but deeply, achingly personal. "As you know, I am going through a difficult divorce," she wrote, "and I am looking for a place to start over. This house, 112 Arbor Lane, has always been my dream. It was the first house my ex-husband and I looked at when we moved to this town. The one we should have bought. Owning it now would feel like reclaiming a piece of the life I was supposed to have. I know my offer is below your asking price, but I hope you'll consider what this home means to me." I leaned back in the worn office chair, the letter resting in my hand. Suddenly, the ferocity of her obsession, the irrationality of her campaign against a simple white fence, snapped into focus. My home wasn't just a property to her. It was a symbol of her failure, her loss. The life she felt had been stolen from her. Every day, she had to drive past my house, her house, and see me, a stranger, living the quiet, peaceful life she believed should have been hers. The fence wasn't an eyesore. It was a daily, physical reminder of her personal grief and envy. It didn't excuse her actions, the corruption, the lies, the abuse of power. They were all hers to own. But it explained the deep, poisoned well from which her malice had been drawn. She wasn't just a caricature of a power-hungry board president. She was a deeply unhappy woman, lashing out at a world she felt had wronged her, and my fence had simply been the most convenient target. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the file. There was no need for anyone else to see it. Her power was gone, her schemes exposed. This final, quiet revelation was not a piece of evidence for public consumption. It was just a sad, human postscript to a long and bitter fight. The next morning, I stood on my porch, sipping my coffee. The white fence stood clean and whole, a simple frame around my small patch of lawn. The neighborhood was quiet, the air calm. The war was over. I had won not by building a better trap, but by methodically exposing a rotten foundation. And in the end, I felt not the triumphant thrill of victory, but the quiet, profound satisfaction of having restored order. And perhaps, in a very small way, having understood the tragedy of the woman who had tried so desperately to destroy it.